This is a Renegade Media Network podcast.
I got to tell you guys about Zippix nicotine toothpicks. They're flavored toothpicks with nicotine in each one. I want to tell you about them because you might have heard them advertised now on some other podcasts because their name is getting out there. Let me tell you this little fact. This was the first podcast that they ever advertised on, and that is because I actually reached out to them. I already used this product, and I thought I might as well advertise for them. That's how much I like them, and I still use them all the time. They're flavored toothpicks, like I said, with nicotine in each one. Check out the flavors. Peppermint, watermelon, excellent. They've got the old school cinnamon. Remember the cinnamon toothpicks you would have as a kid? This is basically the adult version. They've got sweet whiskey, sweet wood. They've got mocha, spice, island clove. Very, very good as well. So basically, if you're trying to kick a bad habit, maybe go for the cheapest alternative on the market. That would be Zippix toothpicks over at zippixtoothpicks.com. And of course, they want to support this show, and so do you. And if you want to buy some of these toothpicks, that helps this show out. So promo code BUCK at checkout, BUCK, gets you 20% off of your order. That is 20% off when you enter promo code BUCK, BUCK, at zippixtoothpicks.com. Let's get to the show.
You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to another episode of the Counterflow Podcast. I'm glad to be doing this one. My guest is Peter Klein, and believe it or not, I know this will shock you, there are people that can give a talk on economics, and it can be really boring and dry. You know, they do call it sometimes the dismal science. And then there's people like Peter Klein. I've watched his videos for quite some time now. He often gives classes and talks at Mises University that they do every year in July. I believe that's when they do that. His videos are so good. He has a very palatable way of explaining things, very cordial delivery, and I've always enjoyed hearing him explain economics, entrepreneurship, and things of that nature. And I wanted to bring him on today. He's very well studied, well versed in discussing woke capitalism. And you know, we get into this too. I'm trying to find a different name to call that phenomenon that is woke capitalism, because I feel a little bit boomerish now saying the term, but everyone understands what you're talking about when you say it. So that's kind of the problem. So we get into that, diversity training, the interesting newfound love of big corporations that the left-wing progressives have now in this country. All these giant banks and corporations and military industrial complex companies, all they had to do is just start putting hashtag BLM and putting out some diversity commercials. And lo and behold, the left just falls right in love, like it's like they're at prom or something. So we get into that interesting flip of the script that's happened lately and all kinds of things. We also get into the progressive era, the cartoonish high school civics version that many people, that's their understanding of the progressive era. And Peter breaks down the Rothbardian actual real take, the real understanding of what exactly happened during the progressive era. I think that's a very interesting topic. And it's, for some of you, it could be a red pill moment if that's not a topic you've studied on before. I would give you this long bio on Peter, but right off the top, we kind of get into what he does and what he does also in relation to the Mises Institute. So let's bring him in right now. Peter Klein, welcome to the show. I'm really happy to have you here.
Hey, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Yes, sir. So this is the first time I've had you, and it's funny, I've listened to you and watched you on so many things. I feel like I could give an intro for you, but I'll let you do the honors. So for my audience who may not be familiar with you, talk about what you do and also your involvement with the Mises Institute.
Sure. I am a professor at Baylor University in Texas. I'm in the Department of Entrepreneurship and Corporate Innovation in the business school. I teach classes in entrepreneurship and business strategy and innovation and similar topics. I've been a professor for more than 25 years. I've been at Baylor for 6 years. I also direct a Free Enterprise Research Institute at Baylor. And I've been involved with the Mises Institute really since my days as a PhD student back in the 80s and early 90s. And I now am a senior research fellow with the Mises Institute, which means I get to participate in a lot of their conferences and interact with other Mises faculty and students. And that's a great privilege and honor for me.
Let's see, how could I phrase this nicely? The student body over the course of your teaching career, has it changed drastically, or were the ones that are taking a class from you at Baylor, they kind of tend to be good folks to begin with?
Well, yeah, I have great students at Baylor. Got to be sure I say this,
Sure.
Because you never know who's going to be listening, but say this right. No. I mean, I think what you're getting at is whether there's been kind of a long-term trend, a change in how students approach their classes. And, we all hear so much about millennials and Gen Zs having a different attitude, different work ethic. I don't know that I would say I've seen a dramatic change in my career. Obviously, so much has changed in the environment. When I started research and teaching, it was in the pre-internet era. And so everything was on paper, books, articles. We were sending letters back and forth in the mail. Certainly nothing like what we're doing now. No Zoom classes, no podcasts, no social media, nothing like that. So, all of us, the way we access information has changed. And I think all of us have a kind of a shorter time horizon, right? We expect instant results. I know I do it too. If I'm searching for, background materials for a research project and, it takes more than 5 seconds for an article to come up, I get frustrated and angry. Well, when I started out, you had to walk to the library and hope to find the book you needed. And if it wasn't there, you had to fill out a request for them to get it from another library. You might be waiting weeks until you get something that you need. So yes, students, just like all of us, are kind of brought up in this instant gratification mode. Does that mean that students, don't work as hard? No, I wouldn't say so. We have outstanding students now, and the kids I see in the summer at the Mises University and other events continue to be outstanding. So I don't know, I guess I'm kind of agnostic on these long-term trends in education and how students interact with their professors and so forth.
It's one of the interesting changes I've seen is, just kind of paying attention to my peer groups and my, you kind of have different layers and you get into acquaintances. And I was in Austin, Texas. I've now moved to a smaller town outside of that, but I do know a lot of people that would call themselves progressives, and they've gone from Occupy Wall Street protesting and things like that of that nature, and that corporations are all evil and selfish and greedy, and they do a lot of destruction, to, something that we're going to talk about, this woke capitalism. And I've actually seen now a leftist friend of mine say, the people on the right need to understand this. Corporations are just made up of people, just like the government is. The democracy represents us, and that's what corporations are now. And I thought, what a funny flip of the switch that's happened here in the way that certain groups view certain things. And of course, now I've seen people on the right now kind of maybe saying, maybe I was wrong on corporations and something's not right here. They've got a lot of power. They've got more power than maybe they should. Maybe we should research on why they have this much power. They're not just some group of maybe entrepreneurs that have no government ties a lot of the times these days. And so I want to talk about this kind of phenomenon that's happened. And first, before we get to woke capitalism, I'm struggling with calling it something else, because once I see Sean Hannity kind of use terms like this, I go, man, maybe I sound out of touch or something like a boomer if I start using this. Is there another name that you ever refer to it by or something? I know everyone understands what it is when they hear the term. That's the problem.
Yeah, I use the term woke capital and woke capitalism because that's become sort of in vogue in the last few years. I don't know, you could call it progressive capitalism or socially responsible capitalism. maybe something like that. But I think nowadays most people know what it's meant. I mean, the term woke is a little bit poking fun at the phenomenon, so I think it serves the purpose. I think that language typically works okay. But you raised an interesting point just in your question about sort of flipping the script. And back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe even 90s, the idea on the progressive left was that corporations, companies, they're part of the establishment. We're sort of challenging the establishment. We're fighting authority. We're for the little guy trying to topple these sort of institutions that hold tremendous power in the economy. You almost have seen a complete reversal of that nowadays, where whether it be corporations, big social media companies, or Disney, or Coca-Cola, or whoever, or even government institutions like the FBI, the CIA, they're kind of much more on the progressive left now. And the right, certainly in the Trump years, right, you had that populist strain within the right that almost, again, it was sort of the people on the right feel like they're the little guy fighting against the establishment. Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey are hardly the conservative right-wing business establishment figures of our parents and grandparents' day. They're very different kinds of folks. And so the whole dynamic, the political dynamic on this topic that we're addressing has really shifted quite a lot. It's become more complicated, more nuanced. The lines are not as clearly drawn. Of course, that makes it interesting for us to talk about and study, but I think that is a really salient feature of our modern kind of woke capitalist era. People are on different sides than they used to be.
So, and just also to make this clear for people that hear the term often and maybe they think, I kind of know what this is. How would you define woke capitalism at this point?
Yeah, as you say, it's a little bit of a loosely defined term, but what most people mean and what I typically mean is the tendency of companies, for-profit private companies, large or small, but especially large, to embrace very explicitly ideas about social justice, climate justice, racial justice, and so forth, kind of things that are part of the progressive lexicon that, again, the old idea was that companies, in Milton Friedman's famous term, had a responsibility to make money for their shareholders. And that was really all they cared about. They were kind of neutral. They didn't take a public position about issues on inequality or gender issues, racial issues. That was just beyond the scope of what corporate executives, with some exceptions, of course, that was not considered to be part of their job description. But nowadays you have companies taking very explicit public positions on issues related to social justice and the environment and social responsibility and so forth. It's considered almost the duty or the responsibility of these large private institutions, not just to make products that their customers want, but also to sort of exercise leadership in shifting society in a certain direction or another on these very broad social issues that have nothing to do with soft drinks or computer software or making widgets or whatever might be the kind of direct mission and purpose of that company.
Where does this stem from? Was there a point in our recent history where you can go, this kind of changed the whole narrative of what's going on here? Or was it a slow process? Does it even pull back to the progressive era? I know Murray Rothbard has had a lot more clarity, for me at least, when you read what he wrote on the progressive era. Seems like there's some elements of that with what's going on now. Where does this recent phenomenon come from, and is it recent?
Yeah, I would say it's useful to distinguish between the sorts of things we're talking about, so-called woke capitalism, with a slightly related but maybe broader concept of cronyism, crony capitalism, or capitalism in a society like ours with a heavy degree of government involvement in the economy. So, as Murray Rothbard, some of the progressive era historians before him have pointed out, that for much of U.S. history, certainly from the late 19th and early 20th centuries onward, we didn't have anything resembling, the free market economy that we talk about in theory, and that maybe to a greater extent existed in the 18th and 19th centuries. We have a society in which government plays a heavy role in the economy. And for many companies, the key to financial success, the key to profitability and firm growth is to have a cozy relationship with government officials, to have this sort of symbiotic relationship in which the government enacts policies that benefit certain companies at the expense of others, and companies spend a lot of time trying to curry favor with those authorities so they can get policies, rules that favor them at the expense of less politically connected firms. So cronyism has been part of our system for 100 years. I think what's new is the specific form in which cronyism takes, right? Again, it was about tariffs or regulation, product market regulation, financial market regulation, antitrust, and so forth. If I'm say an energy company, I want to make sure that government policy favors my particular, I'm an oil company, let's say. I want to make sure that the tax rules and the regulatory system and antitrust policy is favorable to the fossil fuel industry. I don't want the government to promote renewables and wind and electric at the expense of fossil fuels. I want subsidies, I want protection, and so forth. I don't want to compete against foreign companies that are, making the same product or a competing product to my product. That's what cronyism was typically about. Those were the kinds of policies that the crony capitalists were trying to get, passed in their favor. What's more recent, just the last decade or two, is the shift from trade policy and regulation to things like inequality and climate change and social justice, racial and gender issues, and so forth. Now, to some extent, some of those policies could be interpreted as just another form of kind of crony capitalism. Mm-hmm. One example is when you see large companies saying, the government needs to enforce policies that make sure we have a diverse workforce, and the government needs to penalize firms that don't have enough members of certain groups on the board of directors or whatever. You might say, well, how does that benefit a company? Well, like a lot of other seemingly pro-social issues, you often find that large companies favor those kinds of regulations because they think they place a disproportionate burden on smaller companies. Mm-hmm. Right? If I'm a Fortune 500 company, I've got an army of lawyers and PR agents and diversity trainers and so forth. It's easier for me to meet a requirement that we have certain diversity programs in place and so forth than it is for a smaller company, an upstart, maybe a startup company that doesn't have all those middle managers, doesn't have a big HR department, mm-hmm. doesn't have a team of lawyers that can deal with the regulatory bodies. So those kind of rules actually increase the cost of doing business for smaller firms relative to the cost they impose on larger firms. So yeah, even though they do impose a burden on the big guys, they impose an even bigger burden on the upstarts. And that's why you see Fortune 500 companies saying, yes, well, of course we should have laws that say you have to have a certain percentage of females or a certain percentage of people from underrepresented groups on the board of directors. Of course we ought to have that, because they feel like that's giving them an advantage relative to smaller and newer firms.
Are some of the companies that kind of go for this woke capitalism stuff, we'll call it, and the commercials that certainly during the Trump years, a lot of people on the right were writing them off or saying, I'm going to turn off Netflix, I'm going to discontinue my subscription to certain businesses or TV promotions or whatever. I kept wondering, seems like a gamble. Are they just playing the long game and thinking, I've got to be as PC now as possible so that in 5 years, someone doesn't go, look what they did or look what they said? Are they playing the long game in that manner?
Yeah.
Are they thinking that society's headed in a more progressive direction anyway? So they're playing the long game? Because it seems like some of them are losing stuff in the short game.
Sure. It's a good question. I mean, I think there are multiple factors at work. There are different forces that are all pushing in the same direction. One is the one we talked about before, where certain politically connected firms feel like promoting social justice will give them some sort of advantage in the marketplace. I mean, the second reason is some companies sincerely believe that their customers prefer this, that their customers are willing to pay a premium for or are willing to patronize a company that sells products that are perceived to have certain attributes. For years you could go to your local coffee shop and you could maybe for a few extra dollars, few extra cents, you get the fair trade coffee. You get you consume the more sustainable product. Well, if you consume this product, it has a smaller carbon footprint. It helps suppliers in developing countries, et cetera. Well, I mean, in a free market, of course, if consumers value those product attributes, well, then it's in the interest of firms to supply them. There's sort of no problem. So another possible driver of this phenomenon that we're observing is that customers want it, and firms are simply responding to customer demand. I don't think that's true in most cases, but it's certainly a possibility. Another is one that you mentioned, that companies are doing this kind of, cynically is not the right word, I guess technically we would say instrumentally, meaning that these companies, they don't have a deep commitment to social justice, but they feel like if they kind of get out in front of the issue now with their own programs to address sort of woke issues, that will protect them from even, from some future regulations that might really hurt their profitability. Right? We're trying to play nice. We're extending an olive branch to activist groups and to regulators and so forth, so they'll give us a break and they won't come down harder on us later. I mean, a kind of a nastier version of that story is that some of what governments do when they make pronouncements about social justice issues is kind of a veiled sort of extortion threat.
Yes.
Right. We want companies to donate to our political campaigns. We want companies to provide certain benefits to the state. We want them to act in a way that is consistent with the state's objectives. And if they don't, they're gonna, you're gonna pay. It's kind of like finding the dead fish on your doorstep in a Godfather movie. So some of what companies are doing is part of a dance, maybe, to try to avoid something worse happening in the future. But I want to point out one other factor that I think is understudied, but it is probably part of the story too. And it has to do with the makeup of large companies and what different people in these companies do. Let me start with a story that seems like it's often a tangent, but then I'll bring it back to the question. I remember talking to the great Murray Rothbard many years ago about the book publishing industry. The issue was, why are large commercial publishers, which are for-profit companies trying to make profits, trying to create value for their shareholders, why do they publish so many goofy, weird, left-wing books? Why is there so much garbage being produced by for-profit commercial publishers? Why do they seem to have a left-wing bias? And you have a few specialized so-called right-wing publishers, Henry Regnery or whatever, but why are the mainstream publishers so left-wing? And Murray Rothbard's answer was, he said, well, if you think about how the book publishing industry works, lots of books are published every year by the big Random House and so forth. Hardly any of them make money. There's a very sort of a skewed distribution, or what the Wired writer Chris Anderson popularized as the long tail. So in other words, you have a few Harry Potter books come out. You have Malcolm Gladwell books that sell millions of copies and they make a lot of money for the publishing company, but the vast majority of the books don't make any money. So what the executives of publishing companies say to their editors is, look, just if you produce 1 or 2 home runs per year, I don't care about the rest of the stuff you publish. So the top executives, they may have just sort of that same political views as the average American, but the editors, who are the ones who actually choose the book titles, they tend to be very progressive. Progressive people tend to select into that industry for reasons that we can talk about. And so the senior executives don't care that the editors are producing a bunch of weird, commie stuff. As long as you give me 1 or 2 Malcolm Gladwell books and 1 or 2 J.K. Rowling books, I don't care what you do. It gives you cover. So now go to the big corporations. My suspicion is that the typical CEO, the top executives, members of boards of directors of Fortune 500 companies are not especially woke. in their outlook, in their worldview. They're probably just like the sort of typical American, so variety, of course. But the people who are driving, you mentioned some of these commercials. There was a infamous Gillette commercial last year about, going against trying to promote something with challenging toxic masculinity. I don't think the top executives of Gillette were saying, hey guys, we need to put out promotional materials to show that we're super woke and that we're fighting against toxic masculinity. However, there are these sort of swollen ranks of middle managers, people in HR and public relations, the people who are in charge of the ad campaigns, who are really deeply woke. They are seriously committed to woke causes. And, as long as you sell a certain number of razors per year, the top executives don't really care that much. They kind of give these mid-level folks free rein to promote whatever kind of woke causes they want, as long as the company has hit some certain profitability threshold. So I think it's a question of different priorities within organizations, and maybe the people at the top not caring as much. They're not woke, but they're not really anti-woke either. They just don't really care. That's not a priority for them. Whereas the people who are pushing these campaigns, that is the top priority for them. I think you see that at universities also. Mm-hmm. It's why universities are so aggressively promoting, social justice issues and anti-racism and so forth. It's not really that the trustees and the top university officials really care one way or the other, but they've hired a bunch of mid-level bureaucrats who are deeply committed to these ideas and who have been given free rein to implement them in whatever way they see fit. So all of those things are going on. I think each one contributes a little bit to the explanation of woke capitalism.
I want to tell you about your one-stop shop for all things CBD, and they've got a brand new website for you to check out, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. And it's the Paloma Verde store, of course, owned by a great couple, Carlos and Vanessa, out of San Antonio, Texas. Carlos is a very bright young man. I can tell you why. Once you go to the new website, PalomaVerdeCBD.com, you'll realize that he's smart enough to feature the better looking of the two on the brand new website. And you'll see what I mean once you go there. They've got everything you need as far as the world of CBD goes. You can explore their products on the new website page. You can see there, obviously they've got the tinctures, but they've got mint tinctures, they've got soft gels, they've got CBD gummies, multiple flavors of those, the salve stick, the sleep bundle, which I'm going to have to check out. I've not had the sleep bundle yet, but that sounds enticing to me. The menthol sports cream, I can tell you, works amazingly. I've used that multiple times. And one of the biggest fans I personally know of Paloma Verde CBD products is my French bulldog named Lux. He's about 10 years old now, which in dog years makes him like 70 or something, right? He's old, and he gets around like a little old man with his back legs a little bit slower than they used to be, until we started putting the CBD pet products that they have at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. We put it on his food every morning. They also have these dog treats that we give him, and it's amazing the job that the products have done for Lux, my French bulldog. Now he's trotting around like he's young again. He gets in and out of the doggy door with ease, which is a relief to me, I can tell you that. So, of course, I've got a promo code for you. It is BUCK, B-U-C-K. When you enter BUCK, the promo code at checkout, you get 25% off of all of your orders over $75, which is a bargain. That's over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com, their new website. Promo code BUCK, get you 25% off all orders over $75. Let's get back to the show. I've heard you also talk about something that relates to what we're discussing called stakeholder management. And I honestly, before I heard you discuss it, I had never even heard of that. And it seems to be kind of a bigger phenomenon than it was maybe a decade ago. What is that? And talk to my audience and kind of explain them, if you can, even in layman's terms, like, what does this look like? What effects does it have?
Yeah, so you're right that discussions about stakeholder issues and stakeholder capitalism have really taken off in the last decade or two. I mean, a stakeholder, just a simple English definition, a stakeholder in a project or an effort or an organization is just anybody who has a stake in the outcome of that effort, that project, that organization. So in a business context, right? And everybody knows what we mean by shareholder. So a shareholder of a Fortune 500 company is somebody who owns equity in that firm, right? I mean, in a smaller company, a doctor's office or something, maybe it's a partnership, whoever, the owners of that company are the equity owners or the shareholders in that company. So in that firm, even if it's not traded on the stock exchange, the people who own the equity in an organization own the shares. They're the shareholders in the firm. And so as the owners, the classic idea is that, firms, just like any other venture, are ultimately run in the interest of their owners, right? I mean, if you own a car, then who decides where that car is going to be driven and how fast it's going to run and so forth? Well, the owners of the car sort of control the car. So if you, for example, are like a commercial driver, you're a truck driver, a delivery driver for Amazon or something, and Amazon owns the truck, well, then you're not the owner. I mean, you're an employee, you're operating that asset on behalf of the owner of the asset, the company or the shareholders of that company. That's sort of the traditional way we understand any kind of business venture. You have owners and non-owners. Okay, well, what's a stakeholder? So for a company, whether it's a giant company like Amazon or Coca-Cola or Disney, or even a mom and pop store, a stakeholder is any person who has a stake in what that company does. Any person whose well-being is affected by that company's actions. So that would include customers, right? The customer, if I shop at the local corner store, I'm a stakeholder, and whether if that store goes out of business, that's bad for me. If it increases its prices, that's bad for me. Workers are stakeholders. Suppliers could be considered stakeholders. Even people who live in the surrounding community are stakeholders, right? So stakeholder capitalism is the idea that how should a business be run, not in the interest of its owners, who would be shareholders for a big firm, but in the interest of all stakeholders. In other words, Amazon or the mom and pop store should be operated in a way that balances the interests of all of the competing stakeholders. So for example, say the business is, mom and pop store. It's not doing well. It's not making money. It's losing money. What do? Well, probably let go of some employees would be the typical response of the owner. Maybe we need to discount our prices or charge higher prices to try to get more revenues for the business. We need to cut our costs by getting rid of some suppliers and substituting other cheaper suppliers. A stakeholder management model would say, no, you can't do any of those things. You should not fire employees or lower the wages of employees because that is harming one of your stakeholder groups, right? You can't get rid of your suppliers and get other suppliers because those original suppliers have a stake in the firm. Their well-being needs to be taken into account. You can't even shut down the firm if you think going out of business is the best thing, because that will hurt people who live nearby and like to shop at that company. So stakeholder management is the idea that firms should be run not in the interests of their owners exclusively, but they should be run to provide the maximum benefit to anybody in society who would stand to gain something from what that firm does, where that firm is, and so forth. I mean, put that way, it sounds kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Right? It sounds like socialism. I mean,
yes.
One question that comes up in these discussions is, well, who isn't a stakeholder?
Right.
It's kind of like, if you believe in the butterfly effect, a butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, it affects the weather in New York City. Well, I mean, in an interconnected world, and some of your readers probably know, Henry Hazlitt's idea from Economics in One Lesson, or the famous little pamphlet by Leonard Read on the pencil, I-pencil. Any business in society has some spillover effects on other people in society. So, I mean, all of us are stakeholders in every business. So, I mean, it's hard to see where you would draw the line,
right?
And how you would run any firm, without consulting every single person in society. Now, a more reasonable version of this stakeholder model, and the one that is sometimes taught in business schools is, okay, yeah, we don't mean that. We don't mean that crazy thing. What we mean is, sometimes the firm can actually increase its profits and can actually perform better by treating its workers nicely.
Okay.
Right? By taking customer well-being seriously and by treating your suppliers with respect. Well, I mean, that's hardly anything new. I mean, we've always known that, yeah, of course, you don't make money by, beating your employees over the head when they walk in the door, because then they won't work for you. They'll go somewhere else. So if treating stakeholders well simply means we're going to do whatever we can to maintain good relationships with the people we work with so that we can be successful, well, then it's really no different from normal capitalism.
Yeah, it's almost pure free market capitalism. It kind of represents maybe a rising tide lifts all ships type of thought process. And the bastardized version of what you just said is almost like, let's empty the water and all ships sink to the ground at the same time. And
yeah, that's right. As long as we're all sinking, it's fair. But, in a lot of other kinds of systems in Europe, for example, there are many more restrictions on layoffs, right? De facto guaranteed lifetime employment. In France, for example, it's very difficult to shut a factory down, even if it's not profitable, because that would be harmful to the community is the rationale, right? But what is pretty obvious if you think about it is those kinds of rules over time tend to be harmful even for the community, right? I mean, I would never build a factory in a place where I know I'm stuck with it forever, even if it isn't profitable. So in fact, you get less investment to begin with. You get less innovation, you get a less robust kind of system, you get inertia and stagnation. And, that's not consistent with a dynamic, entrepreneurial, innovative, vibrant kind of capitalism, the kind that we want. So I think there's a lot of danger in focusing too much, beyond this sort of instrumental notion that if you treat certain stakeholders well, it's good for the firm, that's fine. But beyond that, I think we run a risk of harming the capitalist system itself.
Something that I had to experience, now it's been probably 15 years, was a diversity training. And I kind of consider myself fortunate. That's the last time I had to be involved in something of the sort. And back then, it was cheesy. Anyone that was a part of it, we were making jokes, and y'all realized this is something we have to go through for our job, and let's just take it and get it over with. And we were done, and I still have, funny stories from it, and it didn't have much of an impact on anyone that was a part of it, other than it took up our time, and it was silly. Since then, I have multiple friends that have these weird, nightmarish stories of what they have turned into now. And so I know that's something that you're able to talk about too. I don't even know where this sprung from, diversity training. I assume it's some kind of PC thing in the 90s. Maybe I'm wrong on that. What's going on with that now, currently? What does it look like? What does it represent in big companies or small ones, for that matter?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, diversity training programs have been around for a while, but they've really taken off in the last, 5 to 10 years, maybe. I think it's just an example of the phenomenon that we were talking about before. Why are companies investing so much more in things like diversity training? Well, it could be a sincere belief on the part of decision makers at the company that having a more diverse workforce leads to improved company performance and better workforce relationships, or it's just the right thing to do for ethical reasons. I mean, it's partly that. Some of it is, I think, an attempt to get ahead of regulations that will come down the pike that will impose certain levels of diversity. I mean, at universities, it's really tied to the fact that the government holds the purse strings in most cases. So what universities are afraid of more than anything else is losing federal funding, right? Losing Department of Education funds, whether it's in the form of student loans or research grants from the National Science Foundation and so forth. So if the government says to be eligible for federal funds or state funds, you need to meet certain requirements, including Title IX rules and making sure that your workforce is sufficiently trained on these issues. So some companies are doing it for that reason, because they have to, or because they're afraid they'll get in big trouble if they don't do it. I think a third reason is the one we were talking about previously, that there are some, kind of people in HR and in the diversity office who are deeply ideologically committed to this set of ideas. And then other people in the organization, whether employees who take the training or maybe executives who have to sign off on the training, they might not be opposed to it, but they're not really strongly committed to it either, but they don't care strongly enough one way or the other to kind of take a stand, or they're afraid of bad publicity. They're afraid of, the social media mob or whatever going after them, so-called cancel culture. So, obviously, as all your listeners know, and on some of these very sensitive issues in our culture today in 2021, I think there's a lot of kind of self-censorship. There are a lot of people who feel like they cannot really say in public what they think on these issues, because there's only one opinion that is considered politically correct. Politically correct sounds like an old-fashioned term.
Yeah.
Sounds almost archaic now, but there are certain views that are considered socially acceptable, and any questioning or pushback or alternative perspective is considered, completely out of bounds outside the Overton window, and nobody wants to be the target of a social media mob. So I think even maybe people who aren't fully on board just kind of go along to get along.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it always seems like it's just pleasing, and I don't mean minority as in racial minority, I mean numerical minority. They seem to be the loudest voices with the woke stuff that we're talking about, but it shuts all the normal people up. So we're sitting here going, okay, I guess I won't, voice my opinion on this political matter on social media because they're going to cancel my account or something. It seems like the loud voices, that is such a small sliver of society, I hope. Maybe you have a different opinion being around universities, but maybe at least in my bubble, it's like there's often people going, why are we, censoring ourselves and canceling other people and doing this and that just to please this loud segment of the insane population?
Yeah, that's a great question, but I think two thoughts on that. One is there's an argument that was made way back in the 1940s by Hayek in a really interesting article called The Intellectuals and Socialism. There, Hayek was answering the question, why are so many members of the intellectual class, the intelligentsia, why are they almost universally in favor of socialism and opposed to capitalism? Again, this was back in 1948, I think is when he first wrote the piece or gave the talk that became the piece. And his answer was, he said, look, it's not the case. So the common inference that many people draw is, socialism is correct. And the smarter intellectuals are smart people. So the smarter you are, the more likely you are to see the light and know that socialism is the way. And so therefore socialism, even more reason that socialism must be true, all the smart people are, support it. Hayek wanted to challenge that with an alternative explanation that was in terms of kind of, people's desire to select into certain professions. So Hayek said, highly intelligent people who like business and markets and commerce and capitalism, they feel comfortable with all those things, are more likely to become entrepreneurs, managers, business executives, right? Smart, intelligent people who don't like markets, don't like capitalism, are more likely to self-select into education, government, the media, and other sort of, positions where by part of the job, it's, they're very public, right? So you don't, the typical entrepreneur, executive, business person, they're too busy running their company to have time to write newspaper articles, back in Hayek's day. Or we might say today, intelligent people who are focused primarily on their company, their profession, some, achievement in the business world. They're not on Twitter. They don't have a Substack. They're not on YouTube. You don't see them. Whereas, smart, intelligent, articulate people who don't like doing stuff in the business world, they're the ones that you see on social media. They're the ones you see in the New York Times. They're the ones you see on, whatever. So we get kind of a biased view. We only see the smart people who are kind of progressive. We don't see the smart people who are less progressive because they're not visible to us. So that's one possible explanation. I think related to that, excuse me just a second, I'm going to close my door because I got some background noise.
Yes, sir.
Sorry about that. Yeah, the joys of working from home.
There you go.
So, a complementary part of that story is there's a lot of interesting survey evidence. If you survey Americans on their political views, you get about an equal distribution. There are just as many people who identify as very conservative or somewhat conservative as people who identify as very liberal or somewhat liberal, using the conventional kind of classification system. But if you ask people not only, what are your views on social political issues, but how important is politics and these sort of social issues, how important are they in your life? People on the left consistently rate those issues much higher on their priority list. So the social and political conservatives, libertarians, people who are not very progressive on these issues, to them, they say, well, what's most important to me is family, community, my job, my hobbies, my church, whatever. Politics, being on social media, fighting with people on Twitter, that's like number 8 on my priority list. Whereas people on the left tend to rank that much higher. That's one of their top priorities. They care about, they're much more passionate about their political views than people on the right, which I think leads to the phenomenon that you described, where it seems like a small percentage of the population is dominating the conversation on these issues. It's probably true that that's going on. It's because the rest of the population, they also, they feel differently, but they don't feel strongly enough about it that they want to take the time to be in your face.
And it's the way Hayek explained that, it feels like now half the population, for lack of a better term, are the ones driving society and the success in a society. And then the other half that don't care much about that part are the ones driving, unfortunately, a lot of the opinions in society.
Well, the great 20th century social scientist Joseph Schumpeter famously argued, he was very pessimistic about the long-term survival of capitalism. But his argument was pretty interesting. He said the problem with capitalism is so good, it's so successful, so good at generating material wealth that it can support huge numbers of people who don't do anything productive. They don't make stuff. They don't serve the consumer. They don't innovate. All they do is, he was writing a long time ago. All they do is become professors or editorialists or journalists or writers. They don't actually add value to society. They just pontificate about how bad capitalism is.
Yeah.
Right? In a less efficient system, everybody would have to take a turn in producing food and shelter and clothing. There wouldn't be time left over for people to be progressive activists.
Right.
But capitalism is so good at producing wealth that it can support a class of sort of parasitic intellectuals who spend their time denouncing capitalism. That was Schumpeter's concern, and there's certainly a lot of wisdom in his argument.
Yes, and I think it's the ubiquitous pictures of left-wingers and quasi-socialists typing on their iPhone, on Twitter, and how evil capitalism and corporations are and whatnot. I want to tell you guys about the official coffee of the Counterflow podcast, and that is Lorenzotti Coffee over at lorenzotti.coffee. I don't really want to specifically tell you about them because I drink it every morning, because I love it, because it's directly imported from Italy. It's in these vacuum-sealed packs. It's in these beautiful tins that look very good on your kitchen counter. Those aren't really the reasons I want to tell you about them. The real reason is because in this day and age, with all of the insanity going on, I think it's nice to be able to have companies that are very like-minded that we can support. And that's very helpful. Everyone's scared now, like, should I support this company? I don't know. Are they crazy? Well, I can tell you, the guys at lorenzati.coffee are really good guys. They're like-minded individuals, and they want to support shows like mine that you listen to. So I think if they're willing to give me a cut of the money coming into them from you guys, that should make you want to support them. You like this show, you want to support like-minded companies, well, here's one for you, Lorenzati Coffee over at LORENZOTTI.coffee. I'll tell you one thing, if you type in promo code BUCK, B-U-C-K, at checkout, you will get 10% off of your order. You'll be supporting a very good company. The coffee is amazing, and it helps me out too. So if you like this show, give it some support. Now back to the show. We touched upon something earlier, and I would love to hear you give an explanation to my audience. I want to really quick hit on, again, the progressive era, because that was a huge red pill for me, is understanding what Rothbard wrote about it, because I've also heard you mention there's kind of a high school civics version of the progressive era, and that is really a very, very common, unfortunately common understanding of it. So could you give kind of that version really quick, and then we'll get into what it actually was?
Sure. Yeah. What I call the high school civics class version is that, in the 18th and 19th centuries, we had unbridled capitalism. We had rough and tumble, dog-eat-dog capitalism that, did produce some achievements in terms of growth rates in the economy and creation of industries, steel, oil, transportation, and so forth. But it came at great cost to society. Women and children were working in the factory, and their quality of life went down, and the environment was despoiled, and certain people were getting rich while the masses were getting poorer. I mean, that's sort of the standard version. Therefore, according to the story, during the progressive era, early 20th century, you had government officials, intellectuals, journalists who were reformers, who decided we need to reform the system. We need to curb the excesses of capitalism, not replace it outright with, Soviet-style communism, but sort of tame its excesses with regulation, right? So we've got to force, food companies to inspect their food so they don't put poison in the food. We've got to have regulations for worker safety, otherwise workers will just be killed in dangerous factories. And we've got to make sure that companies aren't advertising falsely about their products, and we need to have minimum wages and get rid of child labor and so forth. So the idea is that regulation, right, government policy from the progressive elite was getting rid of some of the bad features of capitalism and making capitalism better and safer, adding guardrails or controls or whatever, a safety net to make sure that capitalism would not leave some people or even most people behind. That's the standard version. So, that version, it's so wrong. It's like not even wrong. It's like beyond wrong, because on every single aspect, the historical record, looking at sort of the political economy or the legislative history of all these different progressive bills, and even just thinking about it logically, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So, empirically, historically, almost all of the claims of the progressive era reformers are incorrect. So what happened is you had the emergence in the late 19th century of some large industries, large companies in railroads and energy production, like Rockefeller Standard Oil, and in steel production with Andrew Carnegie's steel enterprise and so forth. The rise of the so-called robber barons. Well, they weren't robber barons. It's not a good term. They weren't robbers. They didn't rob anybody. They just offered goods and services for sale at prices that were cheaper than those of their rivals. They certainly weren't barons. They didn't have any feudal titles. They didn't have any government protection or privilege, but they were successful and very large. However, by the end of the 19th century, their market positions were starting to erode. So there was increased competition from newer, more efficient, smaller firms, right? So on the free market, so-called monopoly positions they rarely emerge in the first place, and they're almost never sustainable.
Yes.
So what was happening by the beginning of the 20th century is these big firms are starting to lose market share All the while, prices were falling, consumer well-being was increasing. So a bunch of these large manufacturers went to the government and they said, we don't like the fact that newcomers are competing with us. What can you do about it? And the reformers said, how about what if we pass a law saying every meat packing plant has to have this level of refrigeration and this many inspections and this amount of cleaning and this standard of equipment. Well, none of that was designed to make meat safer, right? It was all designed to impose costs on smaller meat packing companies, right? In fact, meat packing is a very interesting example because meat packing was going through a sort of a dramatic shift in efficiency. The old model was that livestock or whatever would be sort of would be slaughtered on site, and the local butcher would have a pig or a cow or something and would make it into meat and sell it to customers. So people like Mr. Swift of the Swift meatpacking fame had figured out how to automate a lot of that. That you could have the cattle all taken to Chicago or Kansas City. You could have them processed into meat there, and then the meat put on refrigerated train cars and then sent out to the local communities. And the price of meat would be a lot less, it'd be a lot cheaper. It'd also be fresh and safe and well taken care of. And this was great for consumers. So what happened is the local local butchers associations lobbied to have Swift shut down, right? Because competing against them, he's taking money out of their pocket. So local associations of local butchers went to their representatives and said, you need to get Congress to pass a law to outlaw what this guy is doing. He's come up with a new, more efficient, technologically innovative means of producing meat that we can't compete with that. We want him shut down, right? I mean, of course, nowadays you see this with firms going to Congress to try to get efficient companies shut down through antitrust or whatever. You had that kind of thing going on in lots of industries. So the progressive era, to make a long story short, was really a partnership between government and some politically connected businesses to give them privileges and benefits at the expense of less politically connected businesses.
Yes, well put. And of course, it was sold as the government, the state, we are here enforcing these safety regulations, and we're doing this for the public at large because these evil corporations were harming you, essentially, correct?
Yeah, that's right. There's the economist Bruce Yandel famously came up with the term bootlegger and Baptist coalitions.
Yes. Yeah, explain that. I love when you talk about this. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so the example is, think of Prohibition in the 1920s, right? There were two different groups that stood to benefit from making the sale of alcohol illegal. You had people who had a moral, ethical opposition to alcohol, or rather, I guess I should say, people who thought that alcohol consumption was harmful to society, harmful to workers. And you had a lot of arguments from people like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, arguing that, husbands are beating their wives and workers are not showing up to work on time, and sort of the moral fabric of society is being torn asunder by alcohol. We need to get rid of alcohol to make our society better. That's what Yandel calls the Baptist group, meaning a group that is promoting some policy because they say it's good for society. But of course, you also had other major beneficiary of Prohibition was the bootleggers, right? The organized crime, the mafia, Al Capone, right? These people who were making a huge amount of money selling bootleg or illegal alcohol. The last thing they would want is for alcohol to become legal again, right? So Yandel says something like Prohibition is more likely to be imposed and to persist when you have two different groups working hand in hand, side by side, one that makes money off of the thing being illegal or the regulation, and then another group that can go out in front of the public and sort of make the case for the bootleggers. Right? Al Capone was not going to get, I guess it would be on the radio. He was not going to go on the radio in Chicago in the 1920s and say, we need to keep Prohibition because I am making out like a bandit, literally, right? Yeah. He can't say that, but he doesn't have to because he has these other groups who are going on the radio and saying alcohol is bad. Yandel was one of the cases he talked about in more modern times was environmental rules. So he said, you've got, the Sierra Club and Greenpeace and various other climate activist groups saying we need to cut back on fossil fuels for this and that reason. But what's really driving it is various private interests. So you've got, companies that make alternatives to fossil fuels, or in the example that Yandel was talking about back in the 1980s, the first major piece of environmental legislation in the U.S., the Clean Air Act. The major supporters of the Clean Air Act were large existing factories, because the way that legislation was written, it imposed a whole series of pollution requirements, but they only applied to new construction. So newly constructed factories would have to meet these pollution requirements. Existing factories were grandfathered in. So, of course, owners of existing factories were lobbying very heavily behind the scenes for the Clean Air Act because they thought it would hurt the competition. It would keep anybody from being able to compete with them. And of course, they couldn't say that out loud, but they didn't have to, because they could just let Greenpeace and the Sierra Club do the talking for them.
We have a perfect example of this, and it's been driving me crazy since I found it out. And here in Texas, we have a giant liquor chain store known as Specs. And years ago, I remember there was legislation to finally allow liquor stores to be open on Sundays. So for those of you outside of Texas, yes, they're still closed on Sundays to this day. And I heard that the biggest lobbying group to keep them closed was Specs, because they didn't want to pay their employees to work on Sundays.
Yeah, that's right. I had worked with a master's student years ago who was looking at why different states have different rules about where you can buy alcohol, a state ABC store or the grocery store or private liquor store, and also rules about alcohol shipments over state lines. Some U.S. states you can order, bottles of wine from a vineyard in another state and have them shipped to your door.
Right.
Some states don't allow that. The best explanation, the factor that more than any other factor explained why states have more restrictive rules on interstate shipment of alcohol, was the lobbying strength of the local liquor store association. Right? So, liquor stores in Ohio don't want competition from wineries in California or breweries in Wisconsin. So the stronger the local alcohol retailers association, the more likely you are to get rules restricting interstate purchase. But those rules are always sold as ways of protecting people from alcohol abuse.
Yes, right.
Reducing drunk driving and underage drinking and so forth. Another example, by the way, that's even more salient for most of us is where, sometimes you get the bootlegger, sometimes the bootlegger and the Baptist are the same entity. Look at the big social media companies, right? Who is leading the charge for stricter government oversight on things like consumer privacy, data sharing with third parties? Facebook, Twitter. It's the big firms that say, well, gosh, we need to protect kids and we need to protect consumers from having their privacy stolen. So the government needs to require that all internet companies impose these practices on, all the things you have to click through, especially if you go outside the U.S. To consent to the cookies and so forth. It's the big tech is pushing for more of those rules because it makes it harder for new firms to enter.
Yes.
But they don't say that. They say it's because we care about the consumer.
Right. And then at a time now where you're hearing more than ever, well, go ahead and start your own social media company if you don't like these rules. And all the while they're making it harder and harder to do exactly that. In closing, I would like to hear you explain, or not even, you don't have to go in depth really, give my audience some of the best lessons you can learn from Austrian economics, the philosophy and the school of Austrian economics.
Oh, wow. I would say that, to me, Austrian economics is just, that's good. That's the good kind of economics, right? So the central lessons that we learn from studying a market economy from an Austrian perspective emphasizes things like the role of voluntary exchange, right? Gains from trade, the idea that a decentralized system that emphasizes private property, private ownership, resource allocation through prices and markets, right? That leads to better outcomes than systems of centralized control of production and distribution and prices that are regulated by government officials rather than by the market. I think that, Austrian economics in particular, it emphasizes things like, the role of the consumer as the driver, right? That the only way we can know that certain patterns that we see in the economy are the right ones is because consumers are willing to buy those products and not other products, right? So it's not up to government officials or people in the media or pundits to say, well, it's too bad that we have these kind of cars and not these kind of cars, right? We should let the market make those decisions because the market is just a way of aggregating the subjective preferences and beliefs of individual market participants. Austrian economics also emphasizes the role of the entrepreneur, right? That goods and services don't get produced just by magic. Factories, stores, they don't just emerge and, now we can tell them what to do. No, it takes an entrepreneur, someone willing to take that responsibility, someone who has foresight, someone who's willing to deal with the uncertainties of the future, to put their money where their mouth is, invest resources in creating a product, setting up an establishment, producing, distributing, and so forth, and then competing against other entrepreneurs on the market. So if you kill the entrepreneur, if you kill entrepreneurial initiative with overburdensome regulation and so forth, then you kill, the thing that's the driving force of the whole market economy. So those are things that stand out to me as particularly strong lessons from the Austrian tradition in economics.
I'm so glad there are people like you teaching young people in universities today. It seems to be few and far between, but I'm glad you're there. Plug away at anything, any work you would like to let my listeners know about, any way to follow you on social media, any of that.
Well, yeah, sure. A lot of my articles you can find on the Mises Institute site, mises.org. My social media handle is just my name, Peter G. Klein. My middle name's Gordon, and so it's G as in Gordon. Peter G. Klein is my handle on most social media accounts, and you can find my website on my Twitter profile, where I have academic articles and popular articles that I've written, information about classes that I teach. You can find some of my stuff on YouTube just by searching for my name on YouTube. But I'd be delighted to have conversations with any of your listeners if they want to reach out to me that way. I'm working on my current book project is for a kind of sort of a popular business book that deals with the role of hierarchy in the modern company and also in society at large. I hope that'll be coming out later this year or early next year, and I'll be happy to share some information about that once we're a little bit farther along.
Excellent. That sounds right up my alley, to be quite honest. So thank you so much, Peter Klein, for being here on Counterflow.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. All right. I hope you guys enjoyed that chat with the great Peter Klein. I was really happy to finally get him on the show. Speaking of the show, I tell you all the time, and it's working, so I'm just going to keep pounding this in. The YouTube channel is up and running. When the podcast was called Death to Tyrants, all we had was the still shot, the artwork on there. Not now. Now we have videos. Every time I do an interview, for instance, like this one I did with Peter Klein, you will see the video. All you have to do is go to YouTube, type in Counterflow with Buck Johnson, and you will find it. And my guy, Justin, that puts all these videos together for us, he puts little clips throughout the week. I think those are very easy for you to say. Those are very worthy of being shared, basically. So if you want to kind of show your friends, and maybe they'd get into some of this kind of stuff, little 2-minute clips of my guests making some very poignant points throughout the week. Those are all up on our YouTube channel. Of course, the other thing I've been hammering home is our Telegram group, and it's growing. So the more I talk about it, the bigger the group gets, and I think you guys will enjoy what goes on in there. My guy Bruce in there is always sharing great stuff. Vanessa's in there sharing great stuff. All these people, Tho Bishop's in our group, Matt Erickson. We got a wide variety of brilliant minds, I'll say that, and lots of good article sharing, lots of ideas being tossed around. And so the Telegram app, we've got the Counterflow with Buck Johnson Group. Come on and join us. And the new website. Guys, we got t-shirts. Why didn't I start with this? See, I'm really bad at selling things. That's just not in my nature. But we do have Counterflow t-shirts now available. Artwork designed by neocon remover himself of Twitter fame. We all miss him. Yeah, new Counterflow with Buck Johnson t-shirts. They are up on the website. You can order them through there, counterflowpodcast.com. Check us out. It's got all my links, and everything you need to know about me and the show is on that page. And until next week, I will see you guys later. Have a great week.
You get split in fucking half, till I call the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.
This has been the Counterflow Podcast, a part of the Renegade Media Network.